Okay, good morning, everybody. I hope you can hear me. It's bright and early here in Berlin. I hope you're all doing well. My name's Sean. I'm a historian and I'm a guide here in Berlin, having just come from Moscow. I'm the founder of BerlinHistoricalWalks.com and EasternEuropeExplorer.com, two travel agencies basically. And I'm a professional historian by training and by inclination. So we're going to spend about 30 minutes today, more or less, give or take 10 minutes either side. This is a presentation I originally wrote for the general public rather than travel industry professionals. As I understand, most of us here today are travel industry professionals. So I've amended it a little bit to make it a little bit shorter. I don't think I need to convince anybody on the value of good travel. So really today is going to be about exploring what this concept of mindful travel actually is and how you might implement it in your various businesses. All right. So I suppose we could start off with this quote. I'm sure you've all seen this before. This is by Ibn Battuta. It's attributed to him anyway, a famous medieval traveler. Traveling, it leaves you speechless and then turns you into a storyteller. I suppose for me, that's the essence of good travel, of what mindful travel actually is. Stories, travel can enhance our life, I like to say. And through that enhancement, we can enhance the lives of others. I suppose that's really one of the reasons why we travel rather than just simply take vacations just to get away from the daily grind. So we're traveling in search of storytellers. We're traveling in search of things that make us human. And I suppose for me, this idea first came to me. I don't think I would have articulated it as such, but it first came to me many years ago, back in 1992, when I was a student, 20-year-old studying in Rome. And by chance, I found myself more or less alone in this place, Verdun, which is in the northeast of France. Some of you might know it's a famous World War I battle. It took place in 1916. At the time, it was one of the deadliest battles in history. And when I went there as a 20-year-old, I was studying archaeology in Rome, and I had heard of this place, and that's why I went there. But I really didn't know anything about it. I had no expectations whatsoever. And I arrived there on a misty morning in November, completely alone. And I can promise you, it was probably to this day the only place on earth that I could say is genuinely haunted. There's some kind of, even now I struggle to articulate the feeling of the place. It's like a sort of a layer of madness and human insanity is being kept in check by this thin veneer of time. And as I walked through this place, I felt for the first and only time in my life, the hairs on the back of my neck actually standing up. It was like somebody was watching you. And it inspired me. I understood that there are stories at that moment, you know, in the stories in the sense of first this happened, then that happened, then finally that happened. Yes, but also there's a deeper story. What really happened? What is this place trying to tell you? What's it trying to tell you, about your life, about the human condition, and so on? A deeper story, I suppose. And that's where this idea sort of started to take shape. So what we're doing, we're traveling in search of stories. That's what mindful travel really is. This quote here, attributed to Muhammad, "Don't tell me how educated you are, tell me how well traveled," I think sums it up very well as well. So travel is an investment in yourself. And I think as travel industry professionals, what we're trying to do is encourage people to just look at their travels in that way. That would be the dream, I suppose. So what is it? It's not rocket science, this idea of mindful travel. It's not initially very complex to understand. It's more an attitude. It's an awareness of where you are. It's a particular approach to travel. It's an approach to travel planning. It's a way to sort of look for and find the stories and bring that out for yourself and for your clients. So why stories? Well, we're all storytellers as humans. That's, I think, one of our defining characteristics. So I think in practical terms, we could say that this mindful travel is the marriage of storytelling with trip planning. So by putting storytelling into your trip planning, what you're doing is you're giving yourself or your clients a sort of the trip a coherence, a framework, a structure around which you can build an amazing adventure. So let's take a look at how we're going to do that. So the first thing we're going to do, let me just give you a brief overview here. We're going to spend about 10 minutes or so on each of these topics, maybe a bit less. How to plan a better itinerary, how to take advantage of chance encounters, and then what I've called Ibn Battuta in the travel industry. So just a few words about how I myself implement these things, and it might give you some ideas on how you can do it in your particular business. So the first thing to take a look at here is how to plan a better itinerary. So I like to do this type of trip planning. I call it following in the steps of a famous person or historical event. So perhaps there's a time period your clients or you are interested in, perhaps they're interested in a famous person, and you simply build an itinerary following that person, fairly straightforward. I put here a slide about a trip following in the steps of Napoleon. Now, these are all major battle sites associated with Napoleon. Obviously, there's more to Napoleon than just his battles. And obviously, you can't possibly, unless you've got 3 or 4 months in an almost unlimited budget, you can't possibly cover all of these places. So you just want to take 1 or 2 chunks of it. But what this does is it gives the trip a kind of framework that it would otherwise lack. And I think the major advantage of this is that if you take a look at these places here, some of them are major cities. You've got Paris, you've got Warsaw, you've got Moscow, you've got Madrid. But a lot of these places are in small towns or out in the countryside. And if you pick 1 or 2 episodes from Napoleon's life and follow in his footsteps, what you're essentially doing is giving a mix of city, town, and country that you wouldn't get if you just pluck these sites from a guidebook, right? There's no particular rationale as to why you would visit some of these sites if it wasn't for following in the footsteps of Napoleon in this particular case. And when I suggest to people that they do this, I don't mean that you necessarily have to obsess over Napoleon. It could just be that he's giving you the excuse or the reason, as it were, to visit these places, and then you can do whatever you like when you're there. Of course, if you're more serious about it, you could focus all of your time and attention on Napoleon, but it does give that trip a structure that it otherwise wouldn't have, and it does help you to, or help the traveler to visit places that they would really ordinarily not even think of going to. And I think that balance of country and travel is really quite important. To give another example, here's a trip that's done in the footsteps of Elvis Presley. So he was born in Tupelo, Mississippi, and you can see the trip follows just a couple of key sites, Memphis, Nashville, and then out to Las Vegas. Again, some of these sites you wouldn't necessarily put together in one trip. I don't think anybody would visit Tupelo, Mississippi just on their own if it wasn't for Elvis. But if you think about it, Tupelo, Mississippi is sort of a typical town in the deep south, and you can really, for travelers coming from outside the United States, they're looking at sort of a real place here, not New York, Chicago, LA, where all the tourists usually go, or Florida, the beaches, that sort of thing. There's nothing wrong with those places, but if you want to really get to grips with the essence of America, you have to go to some of these out of the way places, and following in the footsteps of Elvis will help you to do that. Now, I think that's pretty straightforward, following a historical event or a historical person. You can also follow a theme or an idea. This one's a little bit more academic, a little bit more abstract, but I think it sort of gives quite a lot of riches when we get into it. So if we take a look at this temple to Apollo on Naxos in Greece, it sort of sums up the idea here. One of the themes that I like to follow is this concept of what I call liminal zones. So a liminal zone is a border zone, basically. Literally, we get the word limit from. So a liminal zone is a place where one world ends and another world begins, so to speak. So even if we take something simple like the beach, if you stop and think about it for a second, there's a couple of interesting things about beach holidays that I think most people don't take into account. So the first thing is this: going to the beach, historically speaking, going to the beach is a very new phenomenon. Roman emperors did it, but for most of human history, the beach was regarded as a very dangerous place. You had pirates, marauders, natural disasters, and so on and so forth. If you look at the maps of the world, you'll find that a lot of the major seaports, particularly the older ones, are actually not built on the coast. They're built up rivers. They're built in highly defensible places. London, Paris, even Berlin, which is a good 3 hours drive from the nearest coast, was a major seaport in the 19th century. So this idea of voluntarily going to the beach to relax is a strangely modern thing to do. The other thing is, I think it appeals to us going to the beach, and you don't even have to be on the beach. It could be a rocky coast. It could be a cliff, like the cliffs of Moher in Ireland. And if you ask yourself, why are we drawn, as humans, why are we drawn to this place? And I think it has to do with this idea of the liminal zone. So this is an area where one world ends and another world begins. And I think that holds a lot of appeal to us on a very deep level. So when you stand there and you look out over the horizon, you're looking at Yes, you're looking at a nice view, but I think more deeply, people tend to dream when they do that. You know, what's over the horizon, what's next, what lays beyond the next door, so to speak. And I think if you travel with that sort of in search of liminal zones, you produce a lot of interesting travel experiences. And this photograph here captures it rather nicely, because here we have two liminal zones. We've got the beach itself of the rocky coast that I was just speaking about on the one hand, and we have the Temple of Apollo on the other, sort of a gateway from one world into the next, from the world of the here and now into the world of the hereafter, as it were. So you've got two liminal zones. And I think you can see what I'm already starting to do with this idea here, and taking just what looks like a nice view, like a nice holiday, and suddenly it takes on a deeper meaning and a greater significance. So you could plan a whole itinerary around this concept of liminal zones. So for example, you could start off here, you could then travel to the Acropolis in Athens, and one of the grand buildings on the Acropolis in Athens is certainly the Parthenon, that's what everybody goes to see, but also the Propylaea is depicted here on the right in a period, in a reconstruction drawing. And this idea that one of the grandest, most imposing structures on the Acropolis is actually a liminal zone makes your trip come alive. It's marking the boundary between the sacred zone and the profane world. You could then travel up to Notre Dame. These are two not very good photographs of Notre Dame in Paris. One of the things that we've lost in modern times is the sense of color and vivacity. So all these doors would have been painted, all the sculptures there. This would have been something that was brilliantly alive in the Middle Ages. But if you look around the side, we've got the rose window, but mostly the side of the church is undecorated. What is decorated and what was a zone really was these portals, these doors, again, from the outside world into the sacred world inside. And you could go then to Stonehenge, an ancient version of the very same thing. And I think this brings us to an interesting point here. We could also make a point to your travelers, to your clients, that to what extent have we lost this concept? So we could see throughout history, the transitions from one zone to another zone was always marked by grand architecture or by a feeling deep within us that we're entering into a new area, and that has some kind of significance. Nowadays, when we go into our office blocks, we're just pushing through a glass door, right? Or you go into a shopping center, you're pushing in through a glass door. And we sort of lost that sense of majesty of transition. So it's something to think about. And I think what you're doing here by planning a trip around this sort of initially quite abstract theme is you're tying together a series of places with a story that most people would never think to put together in one itinerary. And what you've got now is a trip that sees a lot of the highlights, Paris, Stonehenge, and so on, but you're seeing it through a different lens. You're seeing it through a deeper lens, and that will make for a much more lasting impression. It'll sort of, so to speak, going back to our initial idea, it'll turn your travelers into storytellers. And you can imagine if they've had all these sites linked together with this theme, they'll have something to talk about when they come back. Okay, another theme, if liminal zones is a bit too abstract, you could also follow in the footsteps of painters. You could go and visit the places that actually inspired the painters. You can follow in the lives of the painters. There are some companies which do this here. You can follow in the footsteps of Monet, visit the places which inspired him, and so on. You can also do this, you can also become an artist yourself. Think about this, if you had a client or you yourself want to go to New York City, for instance, or London, doesn't matter. So you could go to New York and you could see the Statue of Liberty and Times Square, and you can tick off all the boxes and so on. But what if you gave yourself an additional purpose? What if you wanted to sort of photo document the lives of New Yorkers, and you set aside a couple of days of your trip, just two, and you went around and you tried to meet some people on the street, for example, a businessman, somebody having lunch, maybe somebody living on the street, chat to them for a couple of minutes about their lives, took a picture. What happens at the end of that trip is you'll have seen all the big things, but you'll have really got under the skin of New York here in a way that you wouldn't if you just went through the city on a tour bus, right? So again, you're just thinking about new ways to extract the story from someplace, to listen further, put your finger on the pulse of what the place is trying to tell you. You can also travel, you can build your itinerary around learning a new skill. This is something that's becoming a little bit more popular in recent years. Thankfully, I think it's a wonderful way to travel. A couple of things I did, you could build a medieval castle. This is a site in Burgundy in the east of France. And I spent a week there volunteering. You get dressed up in medieval garb. And what this project is doing at Guidelon in France is they are reconstructing a 13th century castle using only original techniques and original materials and original tools. So it's sort of an archaeological project, sort of rediscovering how these things were done. But it gives you a really fantastic way to enter into another period and another mindset. And it's also a good workout. It's very hot in the summer, but certainly it's worth doing. And believe me, you'll have a lot of stories you can dine out on these stories for years to come. It's a fantastic learning experience. And of course, while you're there, you can take, as I did, another week after that and just travel around. I used castles as my theme, and I visited a couple of lesser known sites in the east of France. A great experience. Another thing I did was to make ancient mosaics. Now, I'm not an artist, and I think it possibly is apparent by the product on the right. What I did was I copied that rose thing. This is from Ravenna. That's a Byzantine mosaic from the 6th century. The one on the left is an ancient Roman floor mosaic. And again, so the woman who runs this particular place teaches you how to make mosaics in the original Byzantine style. You're using only hand tools, and you're using the original techniques. And at the end of it, you take home a couple of mosaics. And again, it's a fantastic way to travel because you're living in Ravenna in this particular case. And because you're not running around from city to city, you know, one day, one city kind of thing, you're sort of staying in one place for a week, 7 days, and you're going to the same place and you're meeting the same people. You're really getting under the skin of the city. You're getting to live a little bit, at least for that week, like an Italian, but you're also learning about this ancient art. And when you have this experience behind you, when you travel in subsequent years, you start noticing things. When you go into an old building, even years later, you'll immediately notice the mosaics. You'll look at them and you'll judge the quality and you'll remember how you did it and so on. So again, it makes your trip much more long-lasting. There's an opportunity to become a Viking. The company on the right is basically a walking tour. If memory serves, they're based in Norway. Yes, in Norway. And it's just a hiking thing. It's a nature trip, except you dress as a Viking and you cook and you live on the trail, as it were, in the style of a Viking. But this is a perfect way to combine a bit of history, a bit of culture with love of nature, spending time in the great outdoors. On the left is a trip that I took, learning how to sail Viking ships. So this is an accurate copy of a Viking ship in Denmark. It's based on a archaeological find. And they go out twice a year, and you can join, and they just learn more and more about how Viking ships were used and how they were sailed. So again, if you're interested in the outdoors, learning something new, seeing Norway, or seeing Denmark, in this case, the way that the actual Vikings themselves saw it from the deck of a ship, it really brings the place alive and really puts the story into your travels. Paleontologist, this is a little bit older one, but nevertheless still very popular. You go for a week or 2 weeks or however long, volunteer to be a paleontologist, excavating dinosaur bones. You can also pay to go on archaeological excavations throughout the world. Or you be one of Genghis Khan's warriors. There's a very interesting program run by Pioneer Expeditions where you can become a warrior of Genghis Khan for a week, basically. And what they do is they teach you as best as they can how to live like a 13th century horse warrior. So you ride horses for long distances each day. They teach you how to shoot bow and arrow from horseback, teach you how to cook over the open fire in the way that they did back in those times. Fantastic adventure. So instead of just seeing Mongolia through a coach window, you can really get into the spirit of things like this. Or you can join, this is me a few years ago, becoming an ancient Greek hoplite. This is a group of historians. What we do is we reconstruct various epochs in the past in order to learn more about how people lived. And so we go out there and test a theory and spend a couple of days doing it. It's a great bunch of people. You really get into the stories that way, because you're not only getting into ancient Greek life, but you're also getting into modern Greek life. People come up to you and ask you questions. What are you doing? Blah, blah, blah. And you end up speaking to a lot of Greek people that you wouldn't ordinarily do if you were just traveling in a tour group or just taking things off in the guidebook. And so you can find these people in various ways, especially interest groups. This was an author who sponsored this particular thing. So just be curious, I think, and if you're curious, you'll start to find some interesting opportunities, or indeed you could make the opportunities up yourself. Okay, the second sphere, the second area we're going to talk about today, how to take advantage of chance encounters. Now, this is something that's often overlooked. So we've spoken now in the previous 10 minutes about how you can plan a trip using stories as a sort of a framework, different types of stories. But what happens when you're already on the road? What sort of things do you see? Well, responding to a place. So going back to this thing of Noxus, again, I think I already said it at the risk of repeating myself, but when you go to the place, it's just a case of being aware of what's in front of you. So you can stumble upon this view quite unexpectedly. And I think when you do this mindful travel, you're not necessarily obsessed with it. But I don't want people to think that, you know, you're focused 100% of the time on it. I mean, it is also a time for you to, or your clients to relax. But I think being aware of it is the key thing. So when you see something, when you see a view like this, you suddenly can, this idea of liminal zones pops into your mind, and you suddenly have the proverbial moment, and you can spend a minute there contemplating it. And that's really sometimes all you need, is just that little extra moment there to realize something a little bit deeper than you otherwise would. This is the famous story by Hemingway. Apparently, it's the shortest complete story ever written. For sale, baby shoes never worn. And Hemingway wanted people to respond to this and to make a story out of it, to fill in the missing areas. And I think the same thing applies to travel. So there's no one correct way to respond to a place. So I wouldn't want you necessarily to suggest to your clients that you must respond this way or that way to a place. So this story, most people tend to think the story is a tragedy. But if you think about it for a second, it could be a comedy, it could be a drama, it could be an advertising gimmick. So whatever it happens to be, just let yourself explore your emotions, right, and respond to the place that's appropriate for you. I think that's the main idea here. Now, in terms of responding to places and just sort of noticing things, being aware, what's the benefit of being alert to things? This is a photograph I took one evening at the ziggurat in Jolga Zambul in Iran. It's an Elamite structure. It's built about 12th century BC, somewhere in that neighborhood, 13th century BC. It's fantastically well preserved. As you can see, I was the only one there. Very atmospheric and sunset. And I noticed a couple of things. I took two pictures about 10 minutes apart, and I think you'll see the point I'm making right away. So on the left is a paw print of a dog that was imprinted in this mud brick about 3,500 years ago. And on the right, I noticed a dog just sitting there amongst the ruins. And it suddenly struck me the continuity of the place. So, you know, the religion has changed, the language has changed, the culture has changed in that part of the world, but the stray dogs at that particular site still there. And I think that's the sort of connection that you're sort of being open to. You're sort of being open to what the place is trying to tell you, sort of a deeper story, rather than just simply, this was built in this year, and then this happened, and then that happened. Music, I put this slide up here. This is Mayakovskaya station in Moscow. It's a beautiful station built in 1938. But this is again to sort of introduce the idea that you can use all of your senses when you travel mindfully. And what I like to do here, there's a stupid old Soviet songs. I put them on on my earphones, music to listen to. And when you're listening to old Soviet music from the 30s and 40s and walking through this train station, it's like being transported back to another time. It really is. It's almost like a physical experience. And the mood suddenly changes inside of you. And I think the music has the power to unlock some of what these stories are saying. So don't ignore the role of mood music, as I say, when you do this. Now, overcoming annoyances, this is a key part of mindful travel. This is, again, it's an attitude, it's a way of looking at things, which helps people in their travels. The Colosseum is my prime example of this. The Colosseum is one of those places that people dream about seeing. You see it in the glossy brochures. Everyone dreams of that famous view up the Via dei Fori Imperiali up to the Colosseum. And yet when they get there, what do they see? Well, they see the crowds, they see coach loads of tourists coming off, they're warned about pickpockets and scam artists and so on. It's hot, it's uncomfortable, and with a lot of people, you can see this sort of dream that they had sort of crumbling in the face of reality. And they leave Rome sometimes with negative impressions, or they're disappointed in somehow. And I would say to those people, that's so fine, but look at the story a little bit more deeply. So look at this structure. This is an amphitheater that was built to accommodate up to 70,000 people at its capacity. And when these people were there in ancient times to see the games, guess what? The same conditions applied. So it was hot then and now. It was crowded then, like now. There were pickpockets then, like now. There were scam artists then, like now. There were crowds pushing and jostling and so on, then as now. In other words, despite the fact that the place is no longer used as a sort of source of entertainment, I mean, you know, there's no animals killing each other and all that sort of thing. The culture of the games has gone. But still, something of the original spirit of the place lingers. So instead of being annoyed by these situations that we need, ask yourself, just stop and ask yourself, how can you use this to your advantage? How can you use what you're seeing, in this case, masses of tourists, how can you use that to connect back to the past? How can you use that to gain insight into what the site's really trying to tell you? So that's mindful travel in action. Another example to illustrate the point, Versailles. People taking selfies at Versailles. I noticed this once a few years ago. I was standing in the queue to get in, and it was not my first time I was taking somebody there. And I noticed that the crowds were getting larger and larger. And on this particular occasion, I think I stood like 2 hours in the queue. And the queue was going even slower because people just were stopping and taking selfies. And it was easy to get annoyed, especially inside. You know, you're walking up the grand staircase and the person right in front of you suddenly stops for that must-have selfie. And again, it's easy to get irritated by this, right? But again, let's stop and look and see if you can't twist it to your advantage. Now, Versailles, when it was built as a palace, particularly under Louis XIV, it was used as a place to see and be seen. So if you were invited to the palace, if you had business at the palace, this was a wonderful opportunity for you to be seen. You wanted people to know that you were at the palace. That was how you know you had made it. So in some sense, you can imagine that if these 18th century aristocrats had had selfies, they'd have been selfieing the hell out of themselves all day. They would want everyone to know. Their Facebook, their 18th century Facebook would be jammed with these sorts of pictures. So again, it's different. The technology's changed, the culture's changed. We don't get our sort of status now from being close to the king like they did in those days. But nevertheless, to be seen at Versailles is a mark of some kind of status. So in some ways, the essence of this place hasn't really changed. And again, so what we're doing here is taking a potential annoyance and asking yourself, how can you use it to really get into the spirit of the place? Okay, to wrap up here, Ibn Battuta in the travel industry, I put this together just for us as travel professionals. How can we implement this? I think it's pretty obvious. You can extrapolate based on where you are in the tourist industry, how you can use this stuff or not use it. Just some ideas I put here. Ask what? So ask yourself, your staff, your customers, what their passions are. So what sort of stories do they like? What films have they seen recently? What do they read? What news stories do they follow? What do they like to photograph? What sort of music do they listen to? And then ask why. So think about how you can use this stuff to build an innovative itinerary. Can it be a trip based around music, either band history or the places they sing about? Does the tempo of their music, of the films they watch, is it loud? Is it full of action? Does that tell you anything about your customers' likes, how they might like to travel? So the idea here is you're just using these clues to plug into your customers' wants and interests. And if you go fishing in some way, and I don't know how you would do that, you can speak to them on Skype calls, you could ask them via questionnaires, however you want to do that. But the more information you can get from them, I think the more interesting the itinerary will be for them, because you're appealing to them at a very fundamental level. This is a picture of me with a lovely hat on there, leading a tour group through Berlin. What I do in my walks, if you're a tour guide, you can do this. I tell my groups right from the outset the themes I want them to think about. I've found over the years in Moscow and in here in Berlin, and also in the States and London as well when I did this, that the majority of people don't like to be kept guessing. They don't necessarily want to discover midway through or towards the end of the tour what the theme is. So I just tell them immediately outright. I say to my groups, and I have found that 99% of them really love this, is I will tell them, look, I'm not going to tell you the history of Berlin or Moscow from start to finish, right? We're not going through this chronologically. Instead, I'm going to give you a theme. So in the case of Berlin, I tell them that Berlin is a city which accommodates the irreconcilable. Now, it's not a very snappy sort of motto. That's not the city of lights. But I think it's an intriguing thing, and you can see people's interest get sparked by such an unusual statement. And I fill it in. I tell them, look, you know, you look at this, the contradictions in Berlin's history, the things that don't make sense that you're going to see on this trip, and just allow yourself to be open to seeing things that don't necessarily go together, things you wouldn't expect. And what I found on my tours is that when they get into it, when we come to the third and the fourth example of this, people start making their own conclusions. They start pointing things out to me. And you could really see them working, really chewing on the theme, really absorbing the theme. And I think that sort of underlines the value of this approach of giving themes, of giving people a framework around which to build their travels. So again, it's not just let's walk through Berlin and I'll point out 10 interesting buildings that are in your guidebooks and then thank you, goodbye. It's not just a case of memorizing the history and spouting off first this, then that. What you're doing is you're leading them through the city on a theme. And with that note, I think we'll just end up here. This is just a nice picture of Bukhara, which is in Uzbekistan. It's a place that Ibn Battuta visited. And I hope, sort of tying it all together, that I've inspired you a little bit to think of your tours in new ways and to travel maybe yourself in new ways, excuse me, and become a storyteller yourself. So thanks very much for listening. I hope you got some benefit from it. And as I understand, there's time for questions now.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Sean. That was really eye-opening for me. I'm not a tour guide, but I am a storyteller, so I absolutely loved that presentation. So if you guys don't already know how to raise your hand to ask a question, you just need to click on the participants button at the bottom of your screen, and from there you can raise your hand. So while you guys are finding that, I've actually got a couple of questions myself to ask you, Sean, if that's all right. Please. So, I mean, this is a pretty open question, so feel free to kind of answer however you like. But in terms of, you know, following in Elvis's footsteps and other itineraries that are kind of out of the norm and clearly for travelers, I suppose, that don't want to just be another tourist, I'm wondering, you know, for our listeners today, once you've created that trip, how are you then promoting it to that really kind of niche audience to actually get them to book?
Ah, there you go. That's the magic of marketing, which is, I'll be honest with you, is something I still struggle with. I find that if you leave aside technical things like SEO on your website and going to Facebook and, you know, the sort of the standard marketing things, I find that once you get in front of somebody and you're able to communicate with them directly, however that is, by face-to-face, by Skype, by email, whatever it is, as soon as you can get in front of those people, the sort of the philosophy sells itself. Because I think people understand, most people would like to do something a bit different. Nobody wants to feel like they're part of the horde, that they're doing the same thing that everyone else has done. A lot of people end up traveling that way because they don't think that it can be done any other way. Or if it can be done another way, then you have to have a lot of money, you have to have unlimited resources, you have to be deeply experienced. They just think it's not for them. And so they jump on the grand tour for that reason. Another reason people join big tours, just standard tours, is because it's easy. It's just simple. They just want to relax, they want to get away from work. And that's not a problem. I think that you can join an ordinary sort of bus tour, the proverbial bus tour from, you know, London to Paris to Rome, the big three. And fine, so join the bus tour. It's easy, it's convenient, you don't have to do anything to prepare, it's great. But if you sort of absorb the philosophy of mindful travel, you'll still be seeing things that other people might be missing. Referring back to that slide before about Naxos, you know, just you see that sudden unexpected view and you say, So in other words, people can make these itineraries in their own mind, even if the travel agency hasn't done it for you. You can still make them yourself. But in terms of, yes, in terms of finding these people in the first place, yes, that's a perennial problem, I think, for everybody who's in business, how to get noticed. So I wish I had an answer. If I had an answer, I'd be a millionaire, I suppose.
That's very true. Well, I'm in marketing myself, so I always like to ask that question just to see where people are at with it. So I guess I'm also wondering, with these travelers, do you find that as storytellers, are they more likely to promote a mindful tour like this as opposed to, you know, tourists doing the run-of-the-mill type of tour? And what's your experience with that? Sorry,
can you just ask it again? I didn't quite catch the first part.
Yeah, so I'm just wondering, with these travelers that you know, you've kind of taught to be storytellers, do you find that they're more likely to promote a tour like this as opposed to, you know, tourists doing just the basic run-of-the-mill kind of a tour?
Yes, I think so, because the majority of these people end up being inspired by what they've seen. And so all you're basically doing is unlocking a door for them, and then they're pushing it open and they're exploring it and discovering it. And I think when you give people that sense of empowerment, they're much more likely to spread the word to their friends, to talk about it on whatever social media they use, if any. Certainly they're going to talk about it to their friends more because they feel, and I saw this many times through the tours I lead through Berlin, when they start to tell me examples of the trip's theme, you could see that they're inspired by it. And they're going to encourage people to visit your particular company. But even just in the larger sense, they're going to keep talking about it for much longer than if you just simply drag them through a place and said, look left, look right, okay, back to their hotel. You see, so yes, you are in some sense creating advocates for this way of travel, certainly.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably the biggest benefit of it. It's kind of like my previous question. It's kind of free marketing in a sense.
It basically is. Yeah, it's very effective. It's a long-term play. Because obviously a lot of people conceive of traveling as you still get a lot of once in a lifetime travelers. So it plants a seed that might come to fruition 5 years later. But that's all right. So you just get enough people out there, and you'll spread the word.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I know personally, I'd be a lot more. I'd be talking a lot more about a tour where I learned to be a Viking than just going to the Colosseum and just looking with everybody else. So I think
even just going to the Colosseum, like if you go to the Colosseum, this is one of the things I love about that particular point, is that you can go to the Colosseum and you can be desperately uncomfortable. You can be watching for pickpockets. You can be overheated and jostled, and then be thrilled by that, because that's exactly what the ancient Romans were going through 2,000 years ago.
That's right. I absolutely loved that point that you made. In turning it around, making it a positive, and helping them to realize, hey, this is a legitimate experience. It's more akin to what they actually felt.
Yeah, and if you think about it, like with the Colosseum, if you had by some miracle the Colosseum all to yourself, and you had that, the famous photographs that everybody sees in the tourist literature of the sort of the view up to the Colosseum with no cars, it's magically empty of cars, it's at night, and the things all lit up beautifully. That's an experience that no ancient Roman would have had, apart from the fact that there wasn't electric lighting and that street didn't exist. That's, the idea of this place being totally empty would have been stranger to an ancient Roman than the idea of the place being full of people. So you're getting a more authentic experience. I think that's the idea, is when you travel, you're looking for two stories. You're looking for what happened, but you're looking for the deeper story, the message. And it sort of hits you, the message, when you discover it. And as I say, it could be different for everybody. It is not necessarily one story that everybody has to discover. People can discover their own stories. For me, that's how I deal with it anyway.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you'd get some great photos of the Colosseum that way, but it would be much less authentic. Absolutely.
Exactly. I think authenticity is a good word, because I think people respond to experiences which are authentic to them. And that beach thing, this idea of the liminal zone. I think anybody who's ever gone to the beach has felt compelled to be there, and maybe they don't articulate it. Maybe they'll say, "Yeah, I'm just chilling out. I've had a busy couple of months at work. I'm taking my week's holiday," whatever the case is. But I think most people would admit to feeling some kind of a deeper attraction to the place. Why are they going to this place? What is it about it? People say it's always refreshing, the air is clean. But there's something deeper than that. There's something fundamental about looking over the horizon, about being on a zone of transition from one world to the next. And all you have to do with mindful travel in this case, you don't have to spend your whole beach holiday meditating on this theme. Just 2 minutes of letting it cross your conscious mind. And that can really make that trip much more meaningful than just simply a place to de-stress, if you see what I mean. Or just the idea, you could just chuckle at yourself, the fact that you're doing something so odd in the course of human history, going to a place which most of humanity regarded as a place of danger or as a place of work, is now a place of relaxation. That's such a different, out of the, from left field thing for people to do, is looking over the span of human history. I mean, all you need to do is just clock it. Just clock that sort of thing as you're sitting on the beach and laying out your towel. And the whole thing becomes, to me, a little bit more richer than it ordinarily would.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I'm surrounded by beach living in Tasmania. So next time I go, I will definitely be thinking about that this is not kind of what used to happen.
Yeah, exactly. And it's fun. And the more you think like this, the more you notice things. You start to make connections that you wouldn't ordinarily make once you start thinking this way. And the more connections you make, the more you become a storyteller. And the more you become a storyteller, the more you tell other people. And the more you, if you're in the business, you promote your business, you promote just the whole concept and get people to travel in a more enjoyable or a more meaningful way.
Yeah, absolutely. It comes full circle,
Exactly.
really, then, doesn't it?
Exactly.
Okay, so it looks like we don't have any more questions from the audience.
Good.
I think it's just me. So
Fantastic.
that's easy. Thank you so much for joining, everyone, and thank you for hosting, Sean.
Pleasure. Thank you.
We will be putting up some new events shortly that I am super excited about. So I hope to see all of you guys at our next webinar as well. So thanks everyone again, and I'll see you next time.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.